So far, we've talked about emotions and how they are powerful physiological experiences, value laden. We've differentiated between emotions, which are very fast, last usually less than 5 minutes, versus traits, which is an emotional predisposition across the lifespan, and moods, which can last hours, days, or even years. Next, we're going to talk about the effect of emotions, which include thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, how emotions influence these things, and thus how we can gain insight into our emotions by paying attention to these things. So, thoughts present themselves to us in a language we easily understand, right? Our thoughts are usually in our native language. Sometimes we have thoughts as like pictures and images, but it's usually pretty concrete. We can understand it verbally in a way that we cannot with feelings. It's not like you get really angry and a little sign pops up and goes anger, or you get really excited and it's like excitement. We have to interpret our feelings, and they're very subjective by their nature. They're subjective, they're abstract, they're messy. And so one way we can understand our feelings is by paying attention to how our feelings influence our thoughts, our physical feelings, and our behaviors. So let's understand emotions a little bit and where they come from. Pretend I'm walking out in the Serengeti like I do all the time, and I see a lion. And I see this lion, and my body immediately responds. So my heart starts beating really quickly, my hands start sweating, I start breathing really fast. And then my mind notices this physical feeling. My mind goes, my heart's beating really quickly, my hands are sweating, I'm breathing really quickly. Something physically is going on with me. And so I scan the environment to figure out what is causing this. And I see the lion, and I go, okay, I'm feeling this powerful physical experience, and I see a lion, so it must be fear. That emotion that I'm experiencing must be fear. And I'm going to run away. And so we have here the feeling, the physical sensation of being scared, the thought of interpreting that, the thought that is associated with that feeling, and then the behavior. Now, if instead of a lion, I see Natalie Portman, I'm going to have a similar physical response, right? My heart's going to start beating, my hands are going to start sweating, I'm going to start breathing really heavily. But this time, my brain's going to have that physical sensation, and it's going to look around the environment, it's going to scan the environment, it's going to see Natalie Portman, and it's going to go, this is not fear, this is excitement. And instead of running away, I'll run towards her. And so there are these three major components of emotions, which is the physical sensation of the emotion, what we call the cognitive interpretation of it, which is just the thoughts that we have about that physical sensation, and then the behavior. So if we want to understand our emotions, we have to pay attention to all of these things. We have to pay attention to how we feel physically, to what we're thinking, and then to how we behave. So feelings give us insight into our emotions. And when I say feelings here, I mean physical sensations. We often use those words interchangeably in our day-to-day life. And that's because the physical sensation that accompanies emotions is such a meaningful part of it, right? But every emotion has a physical sensation. And I remember when my therapist asked me, she's like, how are you feeling? And I'm like, I'm very angry. And she's like, well, how do you know that? And I'm like, how do I know what? She's like, how do you know that you're angry? And that was the first time someone had posed that question to me. And she's like, what does it feel like? And then I began to focus on the feeling of anger, which is just this like tension, right? It's like squeezing all of my muscles, squeezing my jaw. It's this like heat coming off my face, coming off the top of my head, that there is actually a physical sensation that accompanies anger. And that is true of all emotions. And the more intense your emotion is, the more powerful that physical effect is too. Thoughts also give us insight into our emotions. So I'm going to brag here for a second. This is one of my favorite pictures of myself. I'm that tiny little dot in the middle of the picture that's at the beginning of a 1,800-foot rock climb. And as you can imagine, it was a pretty terrifying activity. And I would start getting scared about climbs like this. Like 3 or 4 days before the actual climb. And I would start just having these little thoughts like, oh, what if this goes wrong? Or what if that goes wrong? And those little thoughts would turn into these kind of movies in my head of falling on rocks and like bone jutting out of my skin. And it was just all terrifying. And it's because I had this emotion which would bring up these fearful thoughts. And then, of course, those fearful thoughts stoke the emotion even more, which make the thoughts even more extreme. But the emotion is creating these thoughts in our head, is driving these thoughts in our head. So one way to know you're scared is that you're thinking scary thoughts. Lastly, our emotions influence our behaviors. I try to be a very calm, polite driver, and I think I am 90% of the time. But sometimes I'll notice that I'm like weaving in and out of traffic. I'm cutting people off. I'm like blowing through four-way stops, just like rolling through them, just being a really aggressive driver. And I'll notice that behavior, and then I'll go, oh, I'm in a really bad mood. And like I wasn't aware of the emotional experience of being irritated or frustrated or stressed out, whatever it is. I wasn't aware of the emotional experience of that until I saw the impact on my behavior. So the behavior, how we're acting, can give us insight into how we're feeling. This is really complicated to do well. Our emotions are like this constant sense of mystery. We often struggle to understand why we're feeling what we're feeling. And there's a psychological study that I think shows this really well. They did a study where they made up some reason for the study. It was like a memory study or something. And they had college-aged boys come into the lab on campus and do the study, and they had a female research assistant. And after the study was over, they asked the college guys to rate the female research assistant on how attractive she was. And then they did the study again, except this time, instead of doing it on campus, they had the guys walk across this like rickety bridge that was way up in the air and kind of like a scary experience. And they rated the research assistant's attractiveness again. And as you might guess, the guys that had walked across the bridge rated the research assistant as more attractive. And the reason for that is because walking across that bridge, you get nervous, right? And so your heart starts beating, your breathing increases, your hands get sweaty. You get this kind of nervous excitement in a dangerous situation like that. When you get across the bridge and someone asks you, how attractive do you think this girl is? You look inside of yourself and you go, oh man, my heart's beating pretty quickly. I'm breathing kind of quickly. My hands are sweating. And that same physical experience of fear is essentially the experience you have when you're around someone you're attracted to. And so the guys would confuse the experience of fear for the experience of being attracted. And we do this all the time in our life, that we have this physical experience or this physical reaction to something, and we're unsure of where it's coming from, and we just have to take our best guess. Emotions are just complicated and difficult to understand in that way. All right, so we understand our emotions through the physical sensations associated with them, through the thoughts that they cause us to have, and then through our actions or behaviors. Now, occasionally you're going to get in a situation that is so emotionally powerful that all of these things just freeze up. They shut off. And sometimes you'll be in a discussion with someone, and at 1 minute you are so angry and you're just about to explode, and then instantaneously you kind of go numb and it feels like you're shut off. That's something called flooding, and that's something we're going to be that's really important to understanding self-awareness. It's also really important understanding how to effectively work with other people. Flooding is essentially, it's almost like a safety switch your brain has, where when your emotions become too powerful, too overwhelming, they just shut off completely. And you'll notice physically you have the feeling of being numb. As far as behavior goes, you'll just sit still, or you have this kind of like blank expression across your face, and then your thoughts will kind of just go dead too, and you can't even engage with whatever the topic is anymore. And that's flooding. Flooding is when you are just so overwhelmed with emotions that you click off.